Have you ever wondered why the wealthiest people you know say almost nothing about their money? No stories about the second house, no hints about the number in the account, just quiet. You have probably met someone like this. Maybe a relative, maybe a coworker, maybe someone from your old neighborhood. They drive an old car, they wear the same jacket for years. And then one day you find out, almost by accident, that they are worth more than anyone around them ever guessed. This lesson is also great listening practice for English learners. Here is something that might surprise you. The people who talk the most about money are rarely the ones who have the most of it. The ones who actually built real wealth tend to disappear into ordinary life. They do not need you to know. They do not need anyone to know. By the end of this lesson, you will understand why the truly wealthy stay quiet and how learning their silence can change the way you handle your own money and your own life. We are not talking about hiding money out of shame. We are talking about something deeper, a mindset, a discipline, a quiet confidence that does not need a witness. This distinction matters because plenty of people confuse silence about money with secrecy born from embarrassment. What you are about to learn is closer to the opposite. It is a choice made from strength, not weakness, by people who have nothing to prove and no reason to prove it. Real wealth does not need an audience. Hold that sentence for a moment, because everything you hear today circles back to it. A man who kept one modest home for over 60 years, even after becoming one of the richest people alive. A furniture empire builder who drove an old car long past the point where most people would have upgraded. A businessman who gave away almost everything he owned so quietly that hardly anyone noticed until the giving was already finished. Ordinary lives will show up too, and they matter just as much as the famous ones. A young entrepreneur who learned a painful lesson about bragging. A neighbor who kept a secret for an entire lifetime. A woman who had to unlearn everything she thought wealth was supposed to look like. None of them are famous for shouting about their success. Each one is proof in a different setting of something quieter and far more powerful than any headline. Stay with this one, because it might change how you see your own bank account, your own choices, and maybe even your own life. Most financial habits form by watching what other people spend. A friend buys a new car, and suddenly it feels normal to consider one too. A coworker mentions a vacation, and a quiet voice starts wondering why that has not happened yet. Habits build this way by copying the visible choices of people nearby. But the visible choices are almost never the ones that build lasting wealth. The choices that actually built wealth were usually invisible, made quietly over years. Nobody was watching. That is exactly why this lesson matters. If most financial behavior comes from copying what other people show, and the wealthiest people show almost nothing, an entire generation ends up learning from the wrong example without ever realizing it. Let's start with the paradox that most people never notice. Lesson 1. The loud poor paradox. Notice this. The people who post the most about their success are often the ones working the hardest to convince themselves it is real. Think about the last time someone showed off. A new watch, a new car, a caption bragging about a deal they closed. Somewhere underneath that display there is usually a quieter feeling trying to stay hidden. A feeling of not being enough. A feeling that needs to be covered up with something shiny. A young entrepreneur learned this the hard way. In his first year of real success, he could not stop talking about it. Every dinner, every phone call, every conversation somehow circled back to numbers. his revenue, his new office, his growing team. He thought he was celebrating. He assumed everyone around him was happy for him too. They were not. Slowly, the invitations stopped coming. Old friends grew distant. People he once trusted began keeping their distance, not because they disliked his success, but because being around him started to feel like being measured against him every single time. It took him almost 2 years to understand what had actually happened. He had mistaken attention for respect. He had mistaken volume for value. This is the paradox almost nobody talks about. Loud spending signals insecurity. Quiet building signals confidence. Someone buying a car they cannot afford is often trying to answer a question inside themselves that no car can ever answer. Someone quietly saving, quietly investing, quietly building has usually already answered that question and simply moved on with life. You have felt this too somewhere along the way. Maybe you scrolled through pictures of someone else's vacation and felt a small ache of comparison. Maybe you stretched your own budget just to keep pace with people who, in truth, may be stretching their own budgets even further than you are. Underneath all of it sits a simple truth. Real security does not need to be announced. Real growth does not need applause. The wealthiest people are rarely trying to prove anything to anyone, because they stopped needing outside approval a long time ago. Social media makes this paradox easy to see if you know where to look. Accounts built entirely around luxury often belong to people renting the image for a single afternoon, a car borrowed for a photo, a hotel room booked for one night, just to fill a feed. Meanwhile, people who genuinely could afford all of it rarely bother posting any of it at all, because the posting itself was never the point for them in the first place. The loudest wallet is often the emptiest one. That entrepreneur eventually changed. He stopped talking about numbers and started talking about ideas instead, about problems he wanted to solve, about people he wanted to help. Something strange happened. His relationships got stronger. His business kept growing. And somehow, without trying to impress anyone anymore, people respected him more than they ever had before. Once you notice this paradox, you start seeing it everywhere, in coworkers, in friends, in strangers on your screen. Watch closely, and a pattern emerges. The person constantly narrating their success is usually the one still trying to convince themselves it is secure. The person who never mentions it at all has usually stopped needing convincing a long time ago. Neither of them says this out loud, but their behavior tells the whole story anyway, if you know what to look for. Lesson 2. Silence as strategy. Here's what changes when you stop announcing your plans before they are finished. You protect them. One of the richest people in the world has lived in the same house since 1958. Not a mansion behind tall gates, not a private island. A simple house in a quiet neighborhood in Omaha, Nebraska, purchased for a modest price long before most people had ever heard his name. Warren Buffett could have built anything he wanted. Instead, he built almost nothing that would draw attention. He kept driving ordinary cars. He kept eating at the same simple restaurants. While his wealth grew into the tens of billions, his daily life barely changed at all. Many assume this is about frugality alone. It runs deeper than that. Buffett understood something few people ever learn. What you reveal, others can react to. What you hide, no one can take. Every time a plan gets announced too early, it invites opinions, comparisons, and sometimes even sabotage. Someone hears an idea and quietly copies it. Someone hears about your progress and finds a way to compete with it. Someone hears about your success and finds a reason to resent it. Staying quiet removes that risk almost entirely. It allows movement without interference, and it allows real work to happen without an audience watching every step, ready to judge, ready to comment, ready to compare. Think about your own life for a moment. The goals you shared loudly with everyone, how many of them actually got finished? And the goals you kept quietly to yourself, worked on without needing anyone's opinion, how many of those actually happened? Plenty of successful people guard their plans closely, choosing to share only once the work is already done. This is not secrecy out of arrogance. It is protection for the one thing outside noise can destroy before it even gets a real chance to grow. Buffett never needed a bigger house to prove what he had built. His quiet, unchanged life said more than any mansion ever could. And it still does. Consider how differently this plays out for someone announcing a business idea to every friend and every relative before a single sale has happened. Feedback pours in from people who have never built anything themselves. Doubt creeps in from voices that were never invited to weigh in. Momentum, the fragile early kind that a new idea depends on, gets spent answering questions instead of doing the work. Silence would have protected all of it. Hold on to this idea because it is about to matter even more. Lesson 3. Status Anxiety Trap. Watch closely because this next part explains something most people never stop to ask. Why do people show off in the first place? Go back to that entrepreneur from a moment ago. Before he changed, before he learned to stay quiet, there was a reason behind all that bragging. It was not simple pride. Underneath it sat fear. A quiet, constant fear that if he stopped proving himself, people would stop seeing him as successful at all. That fear is what status anxiety actually looks like. It convinces someone that their value depends entirely on what other people think of them. And the moment that belief takes hold, a person starts living for approval instead of living for freedom. It rarely announces itself as fear. It shows up disguised as ambition, as a drive to always have a little more than last year, a nicer version of whatever came before. Underneath that drive, the actual question being answered is usually not about money at all. It is about whether a person feels like enough without it. Seeking approval means constantly checking how you appear to others. Seeking freedom means building a life that works for you, whether anyone is watching or not. From the outside, these two paths can look surprisingly similar. Both can lead to hard work. Both can lead to real achievement, but they feel completely different on the inside. One leaves a person always needing the next compliment, the next sign that they matter. The other leaves a person steady because their sense of worth was never borrowed from anyone else in the first place. Something worth sitting with. Those who feel the least secure are often working hardest to look secure. Those who feel the most secure rarely feel any need to prove it at all. Eventually, that entrepreneur understood something uncomfortable. His bragging had never really been about money. It had been about a quiet question he was afraid to answer honestly. Am I actually enough without all of this? Confidence does not need proof. Once that idea truly sinks in, something shifts. A person stops performing their success and starts actually living it. So many people fall into this trap without ever realizing it, chasing status, because it feels like safety, when in reality, it is often the opposite. Status can vanish overnight. Quiet confidence, the kind that does not depend on anyone's applause, tends to stay steady, no matter what happens around it. A useful test exists for telling the two apart. Ask whether a choice would still feel worth making if absolutely nobody ever found out about it. Buying a bigger house because it fits a growing family passes that test easily. Buying a bigger house mainly to be seen driving up to it does not. The test is simple, but almost nobody applies it in the moment because status anxiety works quietly, disguising itself as a normal decision until it becomes a habit. Lesson 4. The compounding mindset. This is the shift that separates people who build lasting wealth from people who only look wealthy for a while. Picture two people starting at the exact same point. The first gets a bit of extra money and immediately upgrades everything. A nicer car, a bigger apartment, new clothes to match, a new image. From the outside, this person looks like they are doing incredibly well. The second gets that same amount of extra money and barely changes how they live. No new car, no bigger apartment, just quiet, steady saving and investing month after month, year after year. 10 years pass, and the first person is often still working just as hard, sometimes harder, trying to maintain an image that costs more than it earns. The second person, the one nobody noticed, has often built something far larger and far more stable. Financial writers sometimes call that second approach stealth wealth. It simply means living well below what you could actually afford, so that money has time and room to grow. This has nothing to do with being cheap. It has everything to do with protecting your future from your own impulses in the present. If this is opening your eyes, tap subscribe so the next lesson finds you. Stealth wealth is not glamorous. Nobody posts about eating the same simple meals for years while their savings quietly compound in the background. Nobody films the version of themselves that says no to another upgrade, another luxury, another purchase meant only to impress people who will forget about it within a week. But that unglamorous discipline is exactly what compounds into something powerful over time. Small, steady choices, repeated without needing recognition, stack on top of each other until the results become impossible to ignore, even though the process itself was never loud. Real growth is quiet, not loud. It shows up in ordinary moments, in the extra bit of income that gets saved instead of spent, in the decision to keep driving the same car for a few more years, in choosing long-term freedom over a short burst of attention that fades the moment the next post goes up. Nobody needs to overhaul their entire life overnight to start living this way. It starts with noticing the moments when pressure builds to look successful and gently choosing to build instead. Because the version of you that grows quietly today is the version who will not need to prove anything to anyone years from now. Compounding rewards patience in a way that almost nothing else does. A small amount, saved consistently, left alone to grow, eventually produces returns that dwarf the original amount put in. The math behind it is not complicated, yet very few people experience it fully because the early years look unimpressive, and unimpressive things are easy to abandon. Those who stick with an unglamorous plan long enough to see it work rarely talk about the boring middle section out loud. They only get noticed once the results are impossible to hide, and by then, the habit itself has already stopped feeling difficult. Lesson 5. Privacy as power. Follow this because it explains why so many wealthy people seem almost invisible. Ingvar Kamprad built one of the largest furniture companies in the world. For decades, his brand was recognized in nearly every country on Earth. Yet, he was known for driving an old car for years past when most people would have replaced it, flying economy class, and living in a modest home that gave no hint of the empire behind it. People who met him without knowing his name often had no idea they were standing next to a billionaire. That was in many ways exactly the point. Privacy was not a side effect of his success. It was part of how he protected it. An ordinary neighborhood held a similar secret. On a quiet street, where everyone waves but nobody really asks questions, one man mowed his own lawn, wore the same worn jacket through every winter, and let everyone around him assume he was simply getting by on a modest pension. Nobody knew the truth until much later. Privacy shields more than a bank balance. It shields relationships. When people do not know exactly what someone has, they tend to treat that person the same way they always have. Nobody starts calculating what they can ask for. Nobody starts quietly comparing themselves at every dinner. A person simply gets treated like a person, not a number. Once wealth becomes visible, invitations tend to change too. Requests for loans arrive from distant relatives. Business pitches arrive from casual acquaintances. Even close friendships can quietly shift once a number enters the room, whether anyone intends for that to happen or not. Privacy sidesteps all of it, keeping relationships built on something other than what someone might be able to offer. What stays private stays yours, along with your peace, your relationships, and your ability to make decisions without an audience judging every move. Being underestimated carries real power. Pressure disappears. Performance disappears. Life gets to unfold exactly as chosen, without needing to manage anyone else's expectations of what it should look like. That quiet neighbor never needed to explain any of this to anyone. He was not hiding out of shame. He was simply living a life that belonged entirely to him and to no one else's opinion of it. Being underestimated also removes a certain kind of pressure that wealthy-looking people carry without ever asking for it. Every purchase gets watched. Every choice gets judged against an image that has to be maintained. Someone who nobody suspects of having much carries none of that weight. They can drive the old car another year, wear the same coat another winter, and nobody reads meaning into it because nobody is looking closely enough to notice. Lesson 6. The Comparison Trap. Think about this for a moment. How much of what gets bought is really for the buyer, and how much is quietly aimed at someone else's opinion? A well-known idea in psychology explains a lot of this. People naturally measure their own worth by comparing themselves to others around them. It is not exactly a flaw, just how the mind tends to work. Trouble starts once that comparison becomes the main thing driving every choice. A woman inherited a large sum of money early in her adult life. At first, she spent freely, almost automatically. New clothes, expensive trips, a bigger home than she actually needed. Each purchase gave her a small burst of excitement, followed quickly by a strange emptiness she could not quite explain. It took time to notice the pattern. Every purchase seemed to happen right after seeing someone else's success online, someone else's vacation, someone else's new car. She was not spending to enjoy her life. She was spending to keep pace with a race she had never actually chosen to enter. Buying status chases a feeling that fades within days. Buying peace builds a life that holds steady, whether anyone else notices or not. The difference shows up clearly in how each choice feels a week later. A status purchase often leaves behind a faint sense of needing the next one, some new thing to restore the same fleeting high. A peace purchase, something bought because it genuinely improves daily life, tends to keep quietly delivering value long after the initial decision is forgotten. Comparison is the thief of peace. It quietly convinces a person that enough is never actually enough because there is always someone newer, richer, or louder just one scroll away. Eventually, she began asking a different question before every purchase. Not, will this impress someone, but, will this actually matter in 5 years? The spending slowed. The emptiness slowly faded. For the first time, her choices actually felt like her own. Inherited wealth is not required to fall into this trap, and it is not required to walk out of it either. It simply starts with noticing whose life is quietly being measured against and choosing to stop. Screens make this trap far easier to fall into than it used to be. A single scroll shows dozens of curated moments from other lives, each one edited to look effortless, none of them showing the ordinary hours that surrounded them. Measuring an entire life against a highlight reel is a losing comparison from the start, because a highlight reel was never designed to be honest in the first place. It was designed to be watched. Lesson 7. Discipline over display. Here's the discipline that quietly separates people who talk about change from people who actually live it. Remember that neighbor from a few lessons ago? The one nobody suspected of anything unusual. When he passed away, his family found something that shocked the entire street. His modest savings account, the one everyone assumed held just enough to get by, actually held several $1,000,000, built slowly over decades of ordinary, disciplined choices. He never bought a bigger house. He never leased a newer car. He simply kept working, kept saving, and kept living well below what he could have afforded, year after year, without a single person around him ever knowing. That kind of discipline is not exciting to watch. No dramatic before and after. No single moment worth filming. Just the same small choice repeated quietly thousands of times until it eventually became something enormous. So many people struggle to build real wealth because they are waiting for a big, visible moment of change, when the truth is that most real change happens in invisible, unremarkable moments. Choosing to cook at home instead of ordering out again. Choosing to walk past another unnecessary purchase. Choosing to keep the same phone for one more year. Discipline never needs an audience. It does not require anyone to witness it, applaud it, or even know it is happening at all. Anyone hoping for motivation to carry them through may be waiting a long time because motivation fades quickly. What that quiet neighbor had instead was something steadier. A simple habit of choosing the smaller, unglamorous option again and again, without needing anyone to notice or approve. At least one small choice like this already exists in your own life right now. Something quiet you could start tomorrow that nobody would ever praise you for. Repeat that choice enough times, and quiet wealth is exactly how it gets built. None of this requires extreme sacrifice or a joyless life. It requires noticing the gap between what feels necessary and what actually is, and closing that gap a little more often than not. Most people already know exactly where that gap sits in their own spending. Acting on that knowledge, quietly, without turning it into a public project, is usually where the real progress happens. Lesson 8. Legacy over likes. This is what lasts long after the applause has faded, and everyone has moved on to the next thing. A businessman named Chuck Feeney built a fortune through duty-free shops around the world. At his peak, he was worth well over $1 billion. Yet almost nobody knew his name, because he spent decades quietly giving nearly all of it away, insisting the gifts stay anonymous whenever possible. Universities were built, hospitals were funded, peace efforts were supported. Through most of it, the people receiving the help had no idea where the money had actually come from. Feeney lived simply, flew coach, wore a cheap watch, and by the time the world finally learned the scale of what he had done, almost everything was already given away. On purpose. Living for likes means chasing a reaction that lasts at best a few days. Living for legacy means building something that keeps helping people long after the giver is no longer there to see it happen. Remember the woman who once spent to keep up with everyone around her. Years later, after learning to buy peace instead of status, she started quietly setting money aside for a scholarship fund in her hometown, something she never posted about. Something most people in her life still do not know exists. Build for decades, not for likes. That single shift in thinking changes everything about how a person spends, saves, and gives. Most viral posts get forgotten within a week of being made. A scholarship that sends a struggling student to college changes the direction of an entire family, sometimes for generations. A quiet gift given without needing credit outlasts every trend, every platform, and every fleeting moment of attention that felt so important at the time. Legacy rarely announces itself in the moment it is being built. It usually only becomes visible decades later, in a graduate who never would have finished school otherwise, or a hospital wing that quietly kept running through years nobody thought to ask who paid for it. The people building that kind of legacy were never around to hear the thanks, and most of them preferred it that way. Neither Feeney nor that woman were ever chasing a moment. Both were building something meant to outlast them completely. A useful question separates the two mindsets clearly. Is this choice meant to be seen or meant to matter? A choice built to be seen usually needs an audience to feel worthwhile, and it tends to lose its shine the moment attention moves elsewhere. A choice built to matter keeps its value regardless of whoever finds out about it, which is exactly what makes it durable enough to outlast a single lifetime. Lesson 9. The Quiet Confidence Shift. Now bring it all together, because every lesson today has been pointing toward this one final shift. A man kept living in the same modest house for over 60 years, even as his fortune grew into the billions. A furniture empire builder drove an old car and flew economy, indistinguishable from anyone else in the airport. A businessman gave away nearly everything he owned so quietly that the world only discovered it after most of it was already done. Ordinary people carried the same lesson in smaller lives. An entrepreneur learned that bragging pushes people away, while quiet confidence draws them closer. A neighbor's entire fortune stayed invisible until the very end of his life. A woman unlearned the habit of buying status and slowly built a life aimed at peace instead. None of them needed anyone to see what they had. None of them needed applause, recognition, or proof. Real wealth does not need an audience. And by now, that idea has shown up in different lives, different decades, and different corners of the world. Your silence can be your strength. And not because hiding is noble by itself, silence protects what matters most. It shields plans from interference, relationships from comparison, and peace from a world that constantly demands proof spoken out loud. Every principle from today circles back to the same quiet truth. The loudest wallet is often the emptiest one. What you hide, no one can take. Confidence does not need proof. Real growth is quiet, not loud. What stays private stays yours. Comparison is the thief of peace. Discipline never needs an audience. Build for decades, not for likes. 9 different lessons, one single thread running through every one of them. People who build something real rarely need the world to watch them build it. Real wealth does not need an audience. Carry that sentence with you long after this video ends, not just as a rule about money, but as a quieter, steadier way of moving through an entire life, unwilling to perform for anyone, unafraid to simply become. None of the people in this lesson arrived at quiet confidence overnight. Each of them faced a moment where it would have been easier to prove something, to spend on something visible, to say something loud enough for others to notice. Each of them chose the quieter path instead. Not because it was easy, but because they had already stopped needing anyone else's applause to know their own worth. That choice, repeated enough times across enough years, is what eventually turned into the kind of wealth that never has to explain itself. Time to bring this journey full circle. A man never left the modest house he bought before becoming one of the richest people alive. A furniture empire builder drove an old car long after he could have replaced it 100 times over. A businessman gave away nearly his entire fortune and asked for nothing in return, not even his name attached to it. Ordinary lives echoed the same lesson an entrepreneur who learned that bragging pushes people away. A neighbor whose fortune stayed hidden until his last day. A woman who traded comparison for real peace. Each one proved the same quiet truth from a different angle. The richest life is not the one everyone sees. It is the one only you truly know. Nobody needs millions to start living this way. It simply takes noticing the moments when pressure builds to prove something to people who honestly will forget about it within a week, and choosing something quieter instead, something steadier, something that belongs entirely to you. Somewhere today, a small decision is waiting, a purchase that could be skipped, a brag that could stay unsaid, a comparison that could quietly be let go. None of it will earn applause, and none of it needs to. That is the entire point of everything covered in this lesson, and it is the one part nobody can do for you. This has also been good practice for anyone learning English through listening. So keep listening, keep growing, and keep building your quiet strength. What is one thing about your finances you keep completely private? Tell me below, because I would genuinely like to know. If today's lesson gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe for more lessons like this one, and I will see you in the next video.